a breezy afternoon in a Philadelphia cafe. The soft hum of life filled the cafe on a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, but inside, the world seemed to slow down. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wove through the air, mingling with the faint scent of pastries warming in the oven. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting gentle patterns on the wooden floor. Conversations ebbed and flowed, punctuated by the occasional clink of a spoon against a porcelain cup or the hiss of the espresso machine. It was a place of simple joys, where strangers shared a momentary refuge from the bustling city just beyond the glass. Among the mix of patrons, a tall young man sat at a small table near the window, his figure partially obscured by the vibrant greenery of a potted plant. Barron Trump, the youngest son of a former president, had chosen this spot deliberately. Dressed in an unassuming hoodie and jeans, he blended into the crowd with a quiet ease that he rarely experienced elsewhere. His broad shoulders were slightly hunched as he leaned over a thick book, its pages absorbing all his attention. The world outside and even the hum of the cafe seemed to fade away as he read, his fingers occasionally brushing the edge of the paper to turn a page. Barron's choice to visit the cafe wasn't arbitrary. He'd sought out this corner of the city in search of something elusive: anonymity. His life, defined by public appearances and constant scrutiny, left little room for solitude. Here, however, he felt a rare sense of freedom. The patrons around him were absorbed in their own livesipine lattes, scrolling through their phones or chatting softly with companions. To them, he was just another face in the crowd, a fellow customer enjoying a quiet afternoon. The window beside him offered a view of the street, where leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and pedestrians moved at a leisurely pace. Occasionally, Barron glanced up from his book, his gaze lingering on the world outside. It was as if he were grounding himself in the ordinariness of it all, savoring the moment. Yet, despite his efforts to remain inconspicuous, there was an air of quiet intensity about him. Perhaps it was the way he immersed himself in the book, or the faint trace of a guarded expression that hinted at the weight he carried. For Barron, this cafe was more than just a place to read, it was a sanctuary. He relished the simplicity of being surrounded by strangers who neither recognized nor judged him. It was a fleeting but precious respite from the complexities of his life. Little did he know, this tranquil scene would soon be shattered by an unexpected confrontation, one that would not only challenge his composure, but also create a moment of connection that no one present would forget. When the stranger's sharp accusations pierced through the cozy atmosphere of the cafe, most people would have reacted defensively or not at all. But Barron Trump's response was anything but expected. Instead of rising to the hostility, he calmly closed his book, placing it gently on the table. His steady gaze met the stranger's fiery eyes. "Sir," he began, his voice soft yet composed, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The words lingered in the air, catching not only the man off guard, but also the attention of the entire room. Conversations hushed as all eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. The man, however, wasn't ready to let go of his anger so easily. His laugh was short and bitter. "Talk? What could someone like you have to say that I'd want to hear?" His posture remained tense, his fists clenched, and his voice trembled with frustration. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit," he offered, his tone remaining even and sincere. The simplicity of the gesture seemed to momentarily unsettle the man. He glared at Barron, his lips curling into a sneer. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you? You've had everything handed to you. You don't know what it's like to struggle." His words were filled with bitterness, yet behind them, there was an unmistakable undertone of pain. Barron's response was measured and thoughtful. "You might be right," he admitted. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you could tell me what that's like." The sincerity in Barron's words was undeniable. There was no hint of judgment or condescension, only an open invitation to share. The man scoffed again, his anger faltering for just a moment. "You think I owe you my story? You think that'll make you feel better?" Barron shook his head. "No," he replied simply. but I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard." The tension in the room shifted. The man's defiance wavered, and after a long pause, he finally grabbed the back of the empty chair, dragging it noisily across the floor. As he sat down, crossing his arms defensively, the first words of his story began to surface, and with them, the start of an unexpected connection. The stranger's voice cut through the cafe like a knife, sharp with accusation and bitterness. Barron Trump, seated quietly by the window, became the center of attention as the room fell silent. The man, tense and glaring, stood just feet away from him, his anger palpable. Most people would have reacted defensively, perhaps even matched the hostility. But Barron didn't. Instead, he closed his book with deliberate calm, setting it gently on the table. His gaze met the stranger's, steady and composed. "Sir," he said, his voice soft but unwavering, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The simplicity of the response took everyone by surprise. The man's sneer deepened, his skepticism unshaken. "Talk? What could someone like you possibly have to say to me?" He shot back, his tone dripping with contempt. His body remained rigid, fists clenched tightly by his sides. Barron didn't flinch. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit," he said, his tone devoid of any challenge. The stranger hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Why would I sit with someone like you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter. What do you know about struggle?" Barron nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the man's frustration. "You might be right," he admitted. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but I'd like to understand. Maybe you can help me see what that's like." The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. The man's sneer faltered for just a moment, though his hostility didn't wane entirely. "You think I owe you my story?" he asked, his voice harsh. "You think it'll make you feel better about yourself?" Barron shook his head, his expression thoughtful and sincere. "No," he replied simply, "but I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard. And I'm here, I'm listening." The tension in the cafe shifted. Conversations had ceased entirely, and even the barista behind the counter had paused mid-motion. All eyes were on the two of them, waiting to see what would happen next. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity, his posture stiff and defensive. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he reached for the empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. Sitting down heavily, he crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes still wary but less fiery. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about struggle? I'll tell you." And so he began. His voice, though rough at first, carried the weight of years of hardship. It was raw and unfiltered, filled with bitterness, but also pain. As he spoke, the room seemed to shrink, the world outside disappearing. Barron listened intently, his gaze unwavering, his body language open and attentive. This simple act of listening without interruption, without judgment, became the turning point. It shifted the energy in the room, melting hostility into something that felt closer to understanding. In that moment, the conversation became more than just words. It became a bridge. The man, seated across from Barron with his arms crossed defensively, took a deep breath. His tough exterior began to crack, and his voice, though sharp at first, softened as he started to recount his story. It was a story of loss of dignity, stability, and identity. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason," the man began, his voice carrying a bitterness shaped by years of struggle. "But you don't know what it's like to lose everything. I had a job, a good one, worked at a factory for years. Then, one day, they closed it down. Just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us. Left with nothing but empty promises." The room was silent, save for the faint hiss of the espresso machine in the background. Even the barista, who had been nervously watching the scene unfold, stood motionless. The man's words gripped everyone in the cafe. "I tried," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Worked odd jobs to keep my family afloat, but when you're barely scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you. My wife, she left, took the kids, said she couldn't live like this anymore. And you know what? I can't even blame her." Barron remained silent, his gaze fixed on the man. He didn't interrupt or interject. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his posture signaling that he was fully present. This simple act of listening without judgment allowed the man's pain to unfold naturally, filling the space between them with raw, unfiltered emotion. The man's fingers traced the edge of the table absently, his eyes distant. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is judging you, thinking you're nothing? That's my life now. Every single day. Around them, the patrons sat in rapt attention. Conversations had ceased entirely, and the usual hum of the café was replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. Some shifted in their seats, visibly moved by the vulnerability of the moment. A woman near the counter dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. When the man finished speaking, he exhaled as if releasing a burden he'd carried for far too long. Barron, his expression steady but filled with quiet empathy, finally spoke. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, he said softly. But I do know what it's like to feel judged. To have people decide who you are before you even say a word. The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. What could you possibly know about that? He challenged. Barron's response was calm, but carried a weight that silenced any retort. Everywhere I go, people see my last name and think they know everything about me. They see a caricature, not a person. And that's something I think we both understand. Being invisible in plain sight. For the first time, the man's posture relaxed. The hostility that had radiated from him earlier seemed to dissipate. You're not what I expected, he admitted, almost reluctantly. Barron smiled faintly. Neither are you, he said. The moment of connection culminated in an unspoken understanding. The man extended his hand across the table, hesitant at first. Barron took it firmly, the gesture carrying more weight than words ever could. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice thick with emotion, for judging you before I knew you. Barron's response was calm, but carried a weight that silenced any retort. Everywhere I go, people see my last name and think they know everything about me. They see a caricature, not a person. And that's something I think we both understand. Being invisible in plain sight. For the first time, the man's posture relaxed. The hostility that had radiated from him earlier seemed to dissipate. You're not what I expected, he admitted, almost reluctantly. Barron smiled faintly. Neither are you, he said. The moment of connection culminated in an unspoken understanding. The man extended his hand across the table, hesitant at first. Barron took it firmly, the gesture carrying more weight than words ever could. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice thick with emotion, for judging you before I knew you.